Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first episode of our podcast, She Said What, where the four of us have unfiltered conversations about the modern landscape as women. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about whether female leaders are truly flourishing during the time of a pandemic.
Okay, so let's get started. I was actually talking to my sister Ria yesterday, and we were discussing how a lot of newspapers and magazine articles have been focusing on how female led countries seem to be responding to the current situation with the pandemic better. And they've actually been really effective in controlling the spread of the virus. And there are lots of examples of this. I mean, take Germany, take Iceland, New Zealand, Denmark, the list goes on. Uh, as a more concrete example, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and I think she's honestly done a phenomenal job of handling the situation. The country has quite a large population, right? And she still managed to control the number of deaths to less than 5,000. I think that's quite amazing.
Exactly, and I feel like I have a similar example. So I was reading about Sanna Marin, who is the Prime Minister of Finland. So she actually takes care of four female-led parties in a coalition, which is actually pretty phenomenal because she has to take in consideration everyone's perspective, which is really difficult. And she's also managed to have fewer than 10% deaths as compared to Sweden, which is quite great, I feel. And a similar example would be that of like Tsai Ing-wen, who's the Prime Minister of Taiwan. So she actually hasn't had a proper lockdown in the country, but she's made she's tried to make successful efforts in like minimizing the spread of the pandemic by testing, contact tracing, and stuff like that. So she's done a really commendable job. Okay, let's just get rid of all the facts and stuff and like just jump right into the conversation. So what do you guys think?
Okay, so lately I've been reading so many articles that are talking about how the fact that some female led countries are performing really well is more of a reflection of the people in the country instead of the leader, and how like the country was progressive enough to elect a female leader shows that they're like really diverse. They'll consider majority as well as minority votes, and they'll ensure that everyone in the country is safe, and they're really open minded in their decision making.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at it, like throughout history and everything, I don't mean to be sexist or anything, but the truth is that men have always been seen as the leaders, women have always been seen as the inferior. But I mean, especially in this scenario where like the world is really, really changing, I feel like a population that's able to like elect a woman to be the leader just goes to show how progressive they are and how open minded they are.
Yeah, and I think while coming up with a response to the crisis, it's really important to be acknowledging of different perspectives and be very respectful. And I think that's one thing that seems to be a commonality between the female-led nations. They seem to be like, so for example, take the case of Germany. She's referred to a lot of authorities in different, like the World Health Organization and many different countries who are coming up with a response. And while tackling such a crisis, it's important to listen to other people, learn from other people's mistakes, and that's the only way you can come up with an effective response to really handle the situation. And now, I'm not trying to say that this is, being collaborative is a more feminine trait or anything like that. That's not my point. But what I'm trying to say is that we need to acknowledge that there does seem to be some kind of a trend that's been established.
Exactly, Risha. Like that makes complete sense because these countries are like forward thinking and they're considering multiple competing perspectives. But then there's like countries like Sweden and Britain, and they aren't really doing the same. They're not leaving a lot of room for dissent. They have only been using one model to predict the growth of corona and accordingly make their policies. So when that's done, they really aren't taking into consideration everyone's benefit. And that obviously doesn't lead to like the most informed and best course of action.
Exactly, and I adding on to Inika, I was like going through a couple of news articles like last week, and I realized that there's this trend between female leaders across the world. I feel like they all possess certain qualities that make them such amazing leaders, especially during a situation like what we're going through right now. So, what do you guys think about that?
I mean, yeah, I do feel like there are some characteristics that people like traditionally associate with women, right? Like, benevolence, empathy, and all of those things. I feel like those characteristics are really helping these women take into account so many new perspectives and acting truly in favor of the people.
Yeah, I think speaking about these characteristics, I think a lot of the female-led nations have been very accountable and very transparent in terms of their actions and how they're, planning to develop a strategy to combat this crisis. And that's exactly what you need during such trying times. Citizens need to have a leader who's calm and rational, and someone who's trustworthy, and they have to have a source of comfort because they themselves are really scared. So take the case of New Zealand and Finland. They've been doing exactly this. They've been announcing daily updates, things like that, which make it very, very easy for the citizens to understand how to deal with themselves. And it's very necessary in a time like this.
Exactly. And like adding on to Risha's example of New Zealand, like take Ardon for example, it only hasn't been her regular updates, it's also the way in which she delivers them. So she kind of just sits in bed, she sits casually, and she announces it in such a comforting manner. And I think like a large part of that can be attributed to women's quote unquote empathetic nature. And because she does that, like people aren't going in a state of panic. They think it's under control because they trust their leader, because she talks to them like a friend. But on the other hand, there's Trump, and he's just making the virus seem so deadly, so dangerous and scary. And he's calling things like a brilliant enemy. And I think that just promotes panic and leads the public into a frenzy and just makes them act rashly. And that's really not what we need right now.
Yeah, and again, like adding on to that, exactly, like literally just that, right? I feel like people generally tend to like overlook these qualities that women possess, right? Like empathy and like emotional intelligence and things like that. Like women are truly leveraging these characteristics that people often think as like weak. They're really leveraging all of these things just to make themselves that much more
Yeah,
strong.
Senj, while I agree with you completely, I want to present a little bit of a contrasting example. So take the case of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She's the former president of Liberia, a country that was hit really, really badly by the Ebola virus outbreak back in 2014. And so she had to make a very difficult decision during these times. Even though Liberia was a country that was dominated mostly by the Muslim religion, the majority were Muslim followers, she still decided that for the good of the nation, it's important to cremate the bodies of those who passed away due to the virus. And this was just done for the good of the people. So it just shows that when push comes to shove, women don't necessarily only rely on emotions. They will be rational and logical, and they'll make the right decision, one which supports and benefits their nation as well as their people.
Exactly, and I feel like adding on to your point, Risha, I feel like women are also very optimistic. I feel like they believe like really strongly in like teamwork and stuff like that. They take into consideration everyone's perspectives, and I feel like that's how they end up making much wise and informed decisions and like react really appropriately and perfectly to a situation.
Yeah, and I feel like that being said, like I do agree with you guys, Risha, Krisha, I do agree, but I also feel that like empathy and having emotional intelligence are not necessarily bad things. I don't think you can like look at this entire situation as like a black or white, right? Like I do think there's a lot of gray in between, and I feel like it's always about a balance between the two. Obviously, women can be rational, can be logical, but at the same time, their empathy is what makes them who they are, is what I feel. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Like people keep saying women think with their heart and not their head, and they make it sound like it's such a bad thing. But first of all, that's just not true. Like we can think rationally, we can think logically, but we also thinking with your heart is not a bad thing. Like who would want a leader who's really stone cold, only just like thinks very rationally, doesn't really take emotions into account? Like we want a relatable leader who we can trust.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think what you guys said is completely true. It's not a trade-off between qualities. It's not an either or type of situation. You need to have both. You need to have both sides. Be empathetic. Be understanding of what your citizen needs and wants, and you have to also be rational and make the difficult decisions when you need to.
Yeah, and I feel like this empathy that women have is like attributed to their own personal experiences, right? I do feel, obviously, we can't generalize anything, but I do feel that on an average, women do have different experiences from men. And these different experiences are what's allowing them to look at the entire pandemic situation from a completely like different lens.
Exactly, and be- this perspective is also gained because of like the different roles women play. So, like maybe for the first time in history, women are our first line of defense against this pandemic because 80% of healthcare workers are female. And for example, like take issues like domestic violence. I'm not saying that men don't face it. It is a very real issue faced by both genders, but traditionally we see that women are a lot more vulnerable to it. And I think because women like really just hurt so much because of it, female leaders can relate to it and they really feel for these women and they want to address these problems quicker and much faster. And I think because they are women themselves, they can also address it better.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, that's exactly what makes this crisis so unique because, when you compare to wars or natural disasters, it does seem as though women are possibly more effective. And that's why, as you said, women leaders could, relate and handle or manage it, better. But what I want to bring up now is something that might be a little bit controversial, but I do think it's equally important to be discussed and addressed. And it's that in general, I think women tend to have to struggle perhaps a bit more for their job. They have to deal with a lot of scrutiny and judgments from a lot of people. So consider the case of Prime Minister Ardern of New Zealand. I mean, she's been judged so much for her age, for her gender, and so this is just a possibility. I'm not saying this is a fact, but it's possible that they have to inculcate or they incubate a greater respect for their job because of this. And they perhaps feel the need to, prove themselves and they have a greater responsibility towards their nation and want to perform well.
I actually have a different perspective from you, Risha. I feel like a certain amount of credit should be also given to men, because I feel like they've actually supported women and brought women back to like where they deserve to be. I mean, it's not like I'm not trying to say that women are not strong or powerful. They're obviously so independent, and they are the future. But what I feel is like we cannot completely scrutinize men and say stuff. We can't just support women all the time. I feel like a certain amount of credit should be also given to men for like supporting women in this current generation and bringing them to their rightful position.
Yeah, and I don't really like, I kind of just want to find a middle ground between the two of you right now. I feel like it shouldn't be a gender battle. Like, at the end of the day, it depends on the characteristics of the leader, is what I feel. Like, obviously, women do have particular characteristics that are helping them, but there are also some men also who are like handling the situation quite well.
I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but like I feel like there's certain countries in the world that are actually economically strong, that were economically strong before a woman later like came into position. I feel like, I mean, I'm again not trying to take anything away from women. Like, I'm not trying to make them less credible than they already are. But I feel like we need to acknowledge both sides of the story, and we need to look at everything from two perspectives. I feel like there are certain countries in this world which were really economically strong before a woman came into power.
Yeah, Krisha, that's actually a really good point. I mean, okay, so when you look at the list of countries which are female-led and performing well during this pandemic, there do seem to be all Scandinavian countries, and as you said, they perhaps have like a deep predisposition to perform well either way, regardless of which kind of leader they have. And speaking about chance and probability and things, I think it's also important to note that many statistics and figures that are released may not be completely like they may not be completely true, because many countries have not necessarily carried out the testing of the virus to the complete extent that is required. And so there it does seem to be a trend that women are performing well, but there could also be a lot of other factors that are affecting this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes perfect sense because, we're doing so much analysis, but what if it's merely just a freakish coincidence? Because there's also countries like Belgium, who with women leaders like Sophie Wilmez, who are doing not as great, because Belgium has had one of the worst outbreaks in Europe in terms of death per capita. Like the death toll has been 7,200 out of 11.5 million. That is one of the highest numbers recorded during this pandemic.
Yeah, and again, like, I do agree with that, but I also want to reiterate that I don't think it should be a gender battle at all, because there are some, okay, obviously, like Inika has pointed out, there are some nations like Britain and the US and their leaders, no tea, no shade, but aren't doing quite a good job at it. But there are some male leaders who are doing really, really well, like Vietnam, South Korea, Australia. All of them are doing really, really well, and it's important to consider the factors that are outside the leader's control, like Risha mentioned, like the benefits of being like an island nation or like having a really high population density. There are also a bunch of like other factors that we should be considering.
So I may be going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but honestly, guys, I don't feel necessarily comfortable with the fact that this has to be a surprise. It has to be something that has to be pointed out. That when you talk about a male-led nation who's doing well, the media will focus on the strategy that they're employing. They won't focus on the fact that he's necessarily a man. That's completely different. When you talk about a woman-led country, I guarantee you, if it's not in the title, 100% in the article, they will mention that this is a woman who's leading it and she's performing this way. And I just I mean, this is a discussion for another day, and I honestly feel like we can go on about this topic for ages and ages, but we want to hear what you guys think.
If you're watching this on YouTube or Instagram, let us know your thoughts in the comment section below.
If you're listening to this on Spotify and message us on any of our social media platforms, we'll be happy to know what you think about it.
I think that's it for today's episode. We'll see you guys next Sunday with another new podcast episode. I don't know how to sign off of this, so just keep vibing.
Oh my God, Sanj, please keep quiet.